A liberal TV host was fired over one sentence, but Karoline Leavitt's response turned the controversy into a national firestorm. The bright studio lights reflected off the glossy news desk as Bryan Covington adjusted his tie. His career had spanned 2 decades of sharp political commentary, heated debates, and a reputation for never backing down from a fight. As the lead host of The American Pulse, a primetime liberal talk show on a major network, Bryan had built a loyal audience. He was bold, outspoken, and never afraid to push back against conservative rhetoric. But that night, he said something that would change his life forever. The segment started like any other, an open discussion about a new piece of legislation making waves in Congress. The bill, controversial from the start, centered around online misinformation and what some called media responsibility laws. The idea was to hold news outlets accountable for spreading false information, but the proposal quickly divided the country. Critics feared it would censor opposing viewpoints, while supporters claimed it was necessary to prevent the spread of harmful lies. Bryan, as always, had plenty to say. Sitting across from him was Jack Delaney, a conservative guest commentator known for his blunt opinions and no-nonsense attitude. Their discussions often got heated, but this night was different. Jack leaned forward, shaking his head. "Bryan, let's be honest. This isn't about stopping misinformation. This is about silencing people. You know it. I know it. If the government starts deciding what's true and what's not, we're all in trouble." Bryan scoffed. "Jack, stop pretending this is some slippery slope to dictatorship. Facts matter. You guys want to scream free speech every time someone gets called out for spreading garbage. Maybe if certain networks weren't feeding the public a steady diet of conspiracy theories, we wouldn't need these laws." Jack smirked. "Oh, so now you get to decide what the truth is? That's rich. What happens when your network gets caught in the crossfire?" Bryan didn't hesitate. His voice was sharp, his tone unwavering. Maybe some voices deserve to be silenced. The moment the words left his mouth, the studio fell into an eerie silence. Jack blinked, clearly caught off guard. Even Bryan seemed to realize the weight of what he had just said. A few seconds passed, seconds that felt like an eternity on live television. Jack chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did you just say that? Did America just hear that?" Bryan tried to recover. "I meant—" Jack cut him off. No, you meant exactly what you said. Some voices deserve to be silenced. That's your side's entire playbook, isn't it?" The producers, sensing disaster, rushed to cut to commercial. The cameras faded out, but the damage was already done. Social media exploded. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, everyone had an opinion. Some defended Bryan, saying he simply misspoke, while others went in for the kill. So much for free speech. Guess we finally know where they stand. He just admitted what they've been trying to hide. The backlash wasn't just from conservatives. Even some of his usual supporters seemed uncomfortable. Journalists, activists, even celebrities, many who had been in Bryan's corner for years, started distancing themselves from him. The network, caught in a PR nightmare, went into emergency meetings. Sponsors threatened to pull funding. The pressure was mounting, and Bryan's fate was hanging by a thread. But the decision came faster than expected. The next morning, the announcement hit the airwaves. Effective immediately, Bryan Covington is no longer affiliated with our network. We remain committed to journalistic integrity and the principles of free speech. Bryan was out. Just like that. But that was only the beginning. Bryan Covington sat in his office staring at his phone. The screen was flooded with notifications, but he had stopped reading them hours ago. His inbox was overflowing, some messages from colleagues offering half-hearted support, others from people he thought were friends, suddenly too busy to talk. Then there were the threats, the insults, the people who wanted him erased from public life. The network's decision to fire him overnight wasn't just swift, it was ruthless. There was no internal review, no opportunity to explain himself. One moment, he was a respected voice in primetime media, and the next, he was radioactive. But the media storm outside his office window didn't care about nuance. On one side, conservative networks and commentators were having a field day. Tucker Calloway, a well-known right-wing talk show host, grinned through his segment as he played the now infamous clip on repeat. "Some voices deserve to be silenced, huh? Well, Bryan, looks like yours was first on the chopping block." Across social media, the hashtag #HadBryanCovingtonExposed trended for the second day in a row. It wasn't just conservatives tearing him apart. Progressive voices were now turning on him too. One of his former colleagues, Dana Prescott, a journalist he had worked alongside for years, tweeted, "I've defended Bryan on countless occasions, but I can't support this. Free speech means defending speech even when we don't like it. Disappointed." That word, disappointed, stung more than anything. But while the left distanced themselves, the right mobilized. Some saw Bryan as a victim of the same system he once championed. They called it ironic justice, a taste of his own medicine. Others, however, saw something bigger, proof that the so-called tolerant left was only tolerant until someone slipped up. Meanwhile, sponsors pulled their funding, and networks scrubbed their archives. It was like Bryan had never existed. His name was removed from past episodes, and reruns of his old shows quietly disappeared from streaming platforms. By the time Bryan finally left the building, the air felt different. The city moved at its usual pace, but there was a chill to it, or maybe that was just in his head. He walked past a newspaper stand. His own face stared back at him. The headline? "The Fall of Bryan Covington. How One Sentence Ended a Career." But this wasn't just about him anymore. The backlash against the network itself was gaining momentum. Some believed they had overreacted. Others argued they had no choice. And then there was Karoline Leavitt. The moment she stepped into the conversation, everything changed. Bryan had expected backlash. He had expected outrage. What he hadn't expected was Karoline Leavitt stepping in. Leavitt was a rising force in conservative media, young, sharp, and unafraid to say what others wouldn't. She had built a name for herself by calling out what she saw as left-wing hypocrisy, and now Bryan Covington had handed her the perfect example on a silver platter. Her statement came just 48 hours after Bryan's firing, during a live segment on the Patriot Hour, one of the most watched conservative programs in the country. She didn't hold back. "So let me get this straight," she said, shaking her head. "A liberal TV host, a man who spent years cheering as conservatives were censored, gets fired over one sentence. And now we're supposed to feel bad for him?" The studio audience chuckled, but she wasn't finished. For years, Bryan Covington has been on the front lines of cancel culture. He called for networks to silence people he disagreed with. He mocked conservatives who lost their jobs for spreading misinformation. He said private companies had the right to deplatform anyone they wanted. And now he's shocked that the same rules apply to him? The clip went viral within hours. But it wasn't just the right-wing audience nodding in agreement. Even some liberals found themselves uncomfortable with how quickly the network had cut Bryan loose. Wasn't this the same channel that had defended other hosts when they misspoke? Was Bryan being held to a different standard? Leavitt's words had done something unexpected. They had turned Bryan into a symbol, not a hero, not a martyr, but a case study in how the system worked and who it worked for. Even those who despised him couldn't ignore the bigger question. If Bryan Covington could be erased overnight, what did that say about the industry as a whole? Major figures from both sides of the aisle began weighing in. Some doubled down, insisting Bryan got exactly what he deserved. Others saw Leavitt's point. This wasn't just about Bryan anymore. It was about control. But as the debate raged, Bryan himself remained silent. Some said he was strategizing, waiting for the storm to pass. Others believed he had nowhere to go, too liberal for conservatives, too toxic for progressives. But silence wouldn't protect him for long, because now the debate was bigger than him. Bryan Covington might have been silent, but the country wasn't. The media storm had mutated into something far bigger than a single firing. It was no longer just about Bryan's words. It was about who controls speech, who gets to decide what's acceptable, and whether free expression was truly protected or just a privilege extended to the right people. Every major news outlet picked a side. On one end, conservative voices framed Bryan as a cautionary tale. This is the monster they created, they argued. The left cheered as people lost their jobs for problematic speech, and now they're eating their own. On the other side, progressive media pushed back. "This isn't cancel culture," one op-ed read. "It's consequences." But the public? They were divided. The comment sections were filled with arguments that blurred political lines. "I hated Bryan, but this feels wrong. If they can take him out, they can take out anyone." If a conservative had said this, they'd be banned from every platform. Where's the consistency? He got exactly what he wanted. He's just mad it happened to him. This proves none of us are safe. One wrong sentence and you're done. And then came the protests. Outside the headquarters of Bryan's former network in Los Angeles, groups from both sides showed up with signs. Some demanded his reinstatement, not because they agreed with him, but because they feared the precedent. Others chanted that he got what he deserved. At one point, two men, one wearing a "Covington got canceled" shirt and another with a "No Platform for Hate" sign, got into a heated argument. The cameras caught it all. It was messy. It was America in real time. Politicians saw an opportunity. A Republican senator from Texas tweeted, "How many times do we have to say it? The left doesn't believe in free speech. They believe in speech they control. Covington is just another example." A Democratic congresswoman from Massachusetts shot back, "Free speech isn't a shield from accountability. If you're upset about Covington losing his job, maybe ask why you didn't care when conservative voices were banned for spreading hate." Meanwhile, Bryan's former employer tried to move on. They released a short statement. "We stand by our decision. Our commitment to journalistic responsibility remains unchanged." But the backlash didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Because now people weren't just talking about Bryan Covington, they were talking about how easily an entire career could be erased. And that conversation was only getting louder. Bryan Covington had been the spark, but the fire had spread far beyond him. In newsrooms across the country, journalists and producers were suddenly rethinking their words. If Bryan, one of the biggest liberal voices on television, could be taken down for a single sentence, who was next? Behind closed doors, executives at rival networks watched carefully. Some debated whether their own anchors had said similar things in the past, words that could now be pulled from the archives and turned into a scandal. Others saw an opportunity. Ratings were soaring. Viewers were hooked on the drama, and cable news networks milked it for everything it was worth. Night after night, panel discussions dissected Bryan's fall like a crime scene. Experts were brought in to analyze whether his firing was justified or if it exposed a deeper hypocrisy within the media. A former news producer, speaking on background to a reporter, said it plainly. "If you think this is about Bryan Covington, you're missing the point. This is about control. Every anchor in this industry just got a warning shot. Stay in line, or we'll erase you." The internet had its own theories. Some believed Bryan's firing wasn't just about what he said, it was about who he had angered. Conspiracy forums lit up with speculation. Was his downfall orchestrated by the very powers he once defended? Was he a sacrificial lamb to prove that no one, not even a liberal heavyweight, was safe? And then came the leaks. A whistleblower from inside Bryan's former network anonymously sent documents to an independent journalist. The files contained internal emails, discussions that had taken place long before Bryan's infamous sentence. One email, allegedly from a senior executive, read, "If we ever need to move on from Bryan, we have options. He's been unpredictable lately. Let's keep an eye on it." The internet exploded. Had Bryan's firing been inevitable? Had the network been looking for a reason to cut ties long before his controversial statement? Bryan himself remained silent, until that silence became impossible to maintain. Bryan Covington had spent 3 weeks in isolation. No TV appearances, no interviews, no public statements. His team, what was left of it, advised him to lay low, let the outrage cycle burn out. But it wasn't burning out. If anything, it was escalating. Leaks about internal emails had only deepened public suspicion. His firing was starting to look less like an impulsive decision and more like a premeditated execution. Bryan knew one thing: staying silent wasn't an option anymore. So he did something no one expected. He booked an exclusive sit-down interview. Not with a liberal news outlet, not with a sympathetic host, but with a conservative journalist known for grilling guests from his side. The move was calculated. If he went on a liberal-friendly network, it would look like damage control. But if he sat across from someone who would challenge him, people might actually listen. When the cameras rolled, Bryan looked different. The usual confidence was still there, but the arrogance was gone. His face was thinner, his voice slightly strained. The interviewer wasted no time. "Bryan, let's cut to the chase. You said some voices deserve to be silenced. Do you still believe that?" A long pause. I spoke recklessly. I was heated. But I won't sit here and pretend I didn't say it. And now that you've been silenced?" Bryan exhaled. He knew this moment would define his future. "I think I finally understand something I never did before." "And what's that?" "That when you celebrate censorship, you don't control where it stops." The interviewer leaned in. "So, do you think you were canceled?" Bryan hesitated. He had spent years mocking conservatives who cried cancel culture. If he said yes, he would be labeled a hypocrite. If he said no, he would be lying. I was discarded. And I think it could happen to anyone." The clip went viral within hours. People saw something in Bryan they had never seen before. Humility. His usual critics still called it performative, a desperate attempt to regain relevance. But to many, his words felt real. More importantly, his firing no longer felt like an isolated incident. It felt like a warning. Bryan Covington's fall from grace wasn't just a story about one man losing his job. It became a symbol, a warning about the fragile nature of influence, the ever-shifting boundaries of public discourse, and the uncomfortable truth about who really decides what can and can't be said. But in the weeks following his interview, something unexpected happened. People started questioning the rules. Journalists, commentators, even former colleagues, some who had distanced themselves when the backlash first hit, began re-examining what had happened. Had Bryan crossed a line, or had he just said the quiet part out loud? Some still believed his firing was justified. Others argued that it exposed a deeper problem, one that wasn't about left versus right, but about power. Because in the end, Bryan hadn't been taken down by public outrage alone. A network had made the call. Sponsors had applied pressure. Executives had decided his time was up. And if they could do it to him, they could do it to anyone. Bryan wasn't looking for sympathy. He knew he had played the game for years, cheered when the tide turned against others, believed in the system until it turned on him. But now he was seeing things from the other side. In a video he uploaded to his personal website, a raw, unedited clip of him speaking from his home, he addressed his audience directly. "I spent years believing I was fighting for something good. I believed I was protecting people from harmful speech, from voices that didn't deserve a platform. But now I see the flaw in that thinking. Because once you start deciding who gets to speak, you're not just protecting people, you're controlling them." He leaned forward. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I've made my choices, and I accept the consequences. But if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's this. The second you start celebrating censorship, you lose control over who gets silenced next." The video exploded online. Some called it a redemption arc. Others called it too little, too late. But one thing was clear. His message had struck a nerve. Because the next time someone else's words sparked outrage, people started asking different questions. Who benefits from the outrage? Who decides what's too far? And more importantly, who's next? The story of Bryan Covington is just one example of how quickly someone can go from celebrated to erased. But it raises a much bigger question. Who really controls the conversation? What do you think? Was Bryan's firing justified, or was it a dangerous precedent? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge the way we see media, power, and influence, make sure to subscribe. Because in a world where one sentence can end everything, staying informed is more important than ever.